And it's going to be a little harder for me to get you up and moving around. Won't have the same impact as you're, isolated in your apartment or workplace or wherever you happen to be today. But I will certainly talk about this environment. Like, we live in strange times, and I've been talking about this concept of adaptive space, or social network analysis, or social capital, and I'll cover all of those today. And I think that it's more meaningful today in this moment than ever. We are social creatures at our core, and in reality, it's very hard for us to approximate that when we're looking through this screen, and interacting with each other. Certainly, it's better than email, if you will, but it's a lot harder to approximate the face-to-face interaction. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about agility, but I want to talk about it in this context of the strange world that we live in, and the one that will probably become somewhat of a new normal. Because I've always thought that relationships matter, but I believe it to be even more true today than ever. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll believe that statement, and I'll be able to bring some evidence and some early thinking around that. This was a study that was done way back in 2014, which feels like forever ago, by CEB. And, it basically says, us as people analytics professionals have been looking at human capital for quite some time. And it basically says human capital matters. Like, literally, as a company invests more and more in human capital, you get a lift on revenue. This particular study says, the more fully invested you are in your human capital processes, you get as much as a 6% bump in overall revenue, which is the axis that it's measuring. But this is the part of the presentation that I really want to anchor into, and that is what then happens when you add social capital on top of that. So human capital matters for sure. What your experiences, your skills, your depth of understanding, your competencies, all those things are critical to success. But your social capital is how well you can get yourself positioned inside the organization to leverage those assets. If in fact you have all those things, and we know them, we know those people, they're the smartest people in the room, they show up as the smartest person in the room all the time, but they get themselves quickly marginalized from a social capital lens, then it's nothing but latent potential, latent human capital. The marriage of sort of human capital and social capital, which is how well you can get yourself positioned to leverage what you know, is where you get a multiplying effect and as much as another 8% bump in this particular study from a revenue standpoint. Now, I've been studying, why is it that some organizations are adaptive and others aren't? For like, that core question has haunted me, and I didn't enter into it from a social capital lens perspective, but I've been studying this both academically and practically for well over 15 years now. And this next slide was an epiphany study for me that was game changing. And this was before O&A was a prevalent thing. Just so happens, we were looking at a financial services company, and we were interested in, an acquisition. These are two companies. If I named them, you would know them both by name. This is one small fragment of both of these organizations, but you can see in the red dots, or they show up pink here, a large parent company. That parent company was an operational engine, execution machine. That parent company had purchased, this smaller company for its entrepreneurial ingenuity. And again, you would know the names of both of these companies. The smaller company was super entrepreneurial, very innovative, and had done some game-changing work in one small segment of financial services. You might even say they were fintech before fintech existed. And then this is about a 6-month snapshot of these two companies coming together. And one thing you notice right away is there are very few people connected. If you add up the dots, maybe there are 10, 12 individual people connected from these two organizations. 6 months in, the narrative right now. The parent company is saying we spent how much on this smaller company, and the smaller company saying, how in the world did we let this happen to us? And you know that narrative, like that happens time and time again. And in fact, those 10 people that are circled, I think it's around 10, were actually part of the integration group. So it was actually their job to be connected. So there were very few connections beyond the formal forcing mechanisms to get this organization connected. And we knew this, like we were studying this, but by mistake, we discovered something. And it just so happens that this was declared a failure pretty early on. And people didn't think that this was going to realize the potential from an acquisition standpoint. Yet there was one saving grace. Inside that small little bubble of blue dots, there were a lot of super talented people. And my first love or first profession is talent management. So in this particular case, the talent management systems recognized a few of those people and decided to, well, at least invest in them and pull them into the bigger organization for a broader job or a bigger job. Again, you know that story. Fast forward 9 months later, and you can see a completely different network configuration. And I think it was something like 6 people that were migrated into the org. And it's almost like a completely different entity. But the more important part is the narrative. The narrative started to change. The very same reasons this company was purchased for started to pop all over the organization innovation-wise. This was a huge epiphany for me because I hadn't thought about it like this. And the reality is our social configurations matter immensely to things like agility, adaptation, innovation. And I just started playing that forward. And it turns out that academia is way ahead of us on this. Academics have been studying social networks for years. And they basically said that social capital matters immensely to things like innovation, learning, and even well-being, which I think is incredibly important right now in these times. They also went on to say there are really 2 primary types of social capital. One is called bonding social capital. And the literature tells us that bonding social capital in these small clusters, like what you see on the edge of this particular diagram, can move as fast as 10x or move 10x faster than what the blob in this particular organization could do. And that's indispensable for development. That's indispensable for this world, an agile organization that's trying to move fast, using Scrum methodologies or whatever else to bring something new into the world. And I'll talk more about that. But there's another type of social capital which is equally as important and cannot be ignored, and that's bridging social capital. In essence, bridging social capital, you can think of bonding social capital as the super glue that holds teams together. You can think of bridging social capital is the progress mechanism that is outward focused across the org or even outside of the org in such a way that it's ushering in newness. And you can see here, this is some work that was done up in the MIT Media Lab. Up to 25% more insights are generated through these bridges. And some work that Rob Krause has done has suggested that these bridge people, especially a certain kind of bridge person, an energizer, are really good at getting stuff scaled out and amplified across an org. So theoretically, this data has existed for years. I think it, again, is even more intriguing today as we sit in these strange times. And I want to just click one more time into the gray blob because you can see a lot of bonding social capital there, a lot of tight interactions. This is also the way that you produce. It's also an execution engine. And I think that matters a lot in the times that we're in, because if you look at just the early studies in remote work, as many as 94% of employees surveyed suggest that their companies are as productive, if not more. And I've seen other studies, some have gone as far as saying 47% more productive in these strange times of remote work. And one of the reasons for that is because of these bonding relationships that were in existence before and can simply be transferred into this virtual world to get work done. And we're seeing productivity improvements across the board, really. But I want to caution you, like the rest of this presentation is, let's don't jump to a conclusion. It would be very easy to say, look at this early success. We've proven something to ourselves, and we could do this. There are all kinds of reasons why staying virtual would be advantageous. People love it. It's more flexible at the personal level. You have access to talent markets you might not have had before. And there's a lot of goodness in why staying virtual might make sense. But I want to like the core premise of this presentation is let's don't jump to early conclusions. Because even underneath this, even underneath productivity, and I'm not even getting into the other dimensions yet, even underneath productivity, there are some early signals that we should be paying attention to. This was a study that BCG did just a couple months ago. They sent this report out. And basically what they suggested is to be productive, you first had to have connections, or you had to be satisfied with your connections. And this is super interesting. As much as 2 to 3 times, productivity is impacted as much as 2 to 3x based on how satisfied an individual is with their current connections. If you're not satisfied, you actually see a productivity decrease. And they replicated this across countries. The US was the biggest lift, as many as 2 times in Germany, about 2.5 in India. And the core part of this is your existing social capital actually translates and transfers pretty well into a virtual context if you're satisfied as sort of a starting point. And I want to flip that forward because I've already said that there are different types of social capital or connections. In adaptive space, we actually highlighted 4. I'm going to talk about 3 in particular today that were really critical for enabling agility, innovation, learning, and I've also added in well-being. And specifically, discovery. So we've got to have these discovery connections, which really help us to learn. Ron Burt's work basically says, a broker has 3 competitive advantages. They have early access to new information. They have access to diverse sets of information. And they also have control over the diffusion, which we'll get into the 3rd type of connection in a moment. And that's how we get newness. That's how we continue to reinvent ourselves. And I would argue with you that this is in serious jeopardy in these virtual work time periods. I think the first thing we're going to see is this erosion in innovation well before productivity. We're already seeing it across the world. And I'll talk a little bit about why I believe that's true in a moment. Then there's, a bonding social capital called development. I've already talked about this. Small scrum teams, locally interacting, working in flow with each other, really incredibly good at bringing new things into the world. However, you could also quickly get locked into those new inventions and not get them scaled on across the organization without the 3rd dimension, which is diffusion. And again, I've already talked about that being much more of a brokerage or bridging type of social capital. And you need to think about these 3 types of connections because, some of them sustain better and some of them are established more readily in a virtual context than others. And I'll talk about each of those in much, much more detail. I've shared this slide, over the years. This is Apple data. This, if you look really closely, sort of 6 o'clock, just slightly up from 6 o'clock, you can see Steve Jobs. And this is patent data from Apple. And basically what you begin to see is a very vibrant, healthy network with lots of clustering that is really important for development and lots of bridges. And I oftentimes argue that, Steve Jobs was the consummate broker. He doesn't have the most number of connections here. And this is internal data. You could also argue, and no one really has this data set, he was doing the same thing outside of Apple, connecting across the valley. And I think one of the things that made him such an incredible innovator was his ability to let his network do his work for him. Not that he didn't have great human capital and was super smart, but he was positioned in such a way that he could leverage what he knew, unlike many other people that you see inside this network. And again, super critical for innovation in these worlds. Here's the problem. In this virtual world, discovery is being challenged. And you just have to go back to some old research to see that bridge connections erode far more readily. They're far more fragile, is another way of saying it, than our bonding social capital. And in fact, this was a study done by Rombart way back in 2002. And what he did was, if my memory serves me, he looked at 810 connections, newly formed connections of managers. And within a very short time frame, over nine out of 10 of those had eroded within the first year. So just think about it like this. If we were in person and we were gathering and you met a bunch of people, you would have really good intentions to stay connected to the people that you met. The reality is, and you may actually even follow up one or two times. The reality is, though, stuff settles in. Like we're all busy. And the thing that's easiest to let go of are these bridge connections because we don't have day-to-day dependencies on them. And what ends up happening in this virtual context is these things begin to evaporate. These things begin to become problematic for us because they begin to erode. And on a network, it begins to look like this. This is a fairly healthy network, lots of bridge connections, some bonding social capital in some clusters, very good for innovating and developing, bringing in new ideas and quickly bringing them to life through minimum viable product or however else you want to think about that. But this is what we're beginning to see. The fragmentation, and again, I'll anchor into more and more research to demonstrate this, the fragmentation of the network, first with bridge connections. The very early days, we're seeing a very rapid drop-off of this bridging social capital. And I'll come back to this here in a few moments and talk about it more from a diffusion standpoint. But let me flip forward because I don't think we're off the hook on bonding social capital either. Got some very, very early evidence that bonding social capital could be at risk for us as well, at least certain types of bonding social capital. And remember, I had suggested to you that bonding social capital is super important to bring things into the world. Super important to invent and move really, really fast. So prior to Amazon, I was at General Motors, and this is cruise automation. This is how cruise automation operates. Cruise automation, if you don't know, is a self-driving vehicle startup. And this is the actual network of cruise automation in the earlier days, about 150 people here. And you can see a lot of clusters, through the small little groups of people gathered together here. These clusters, again, are iterating on a day-to-day basis. And just to tell the story real briefly, you got about 150 of these vehicles driving out on the streets of San Francisco. What they really are is data collection machines. Each of these vehicles, you can see the LiDAR system on top. They've got something like 12 cameras. They've got geo-mapping devices. They're basically giant radar devices. They're basically giant data collection devices. Each vehicle has a storage device, about 1.5 terabytes of data they're collecting every single day, times 150, being pulled out of the vehicle at the end of every day after it's driven around on the streets, self-drove itself around on the streets, plugged into the BAT, which is a central database, and then offloaded into these individual groups. These individual groups are a geo-mapping team, a sensor team, a location team. And what they're doing is iterating on their algorithm every single day to the point where a new product exists fundamentally every day. Why does that matter? Because no one's ever done this before. It's a very complex problem, and fast, rapid speed matters immensely in this business. So in as little as 18 months, this organization was able to create 4 generations of self-driving technology using this speed mechanism of a network configuration that was very much approximating how we think about Agile and Scrum in the real world. Just to double click on that for a moment, you see the speed network, that is a cruise, and then you see a more typical sort of research and development group, which is much slower, much more methodical, and you can see relatively the same size networks, but yeah, you can see more connections in the one on the left. But far more importantly than that, you see a greater clustering coefficient, which means small little teams gathering together, iterating on one thing and one thing only. It was very, very intentional to say what those teams worked on. But the more traditional R&D organization you see on the right-hand side is much more of what I call the hedging bets model. In this case, what happens is every individual in that team, in that group, is working on three things at the same time. Why are they working on three things? Because they just don't know which one's going to hit, like which one's going to really stick and which one isn't. So they're hedging their bets. The problem with that model is a shifting cost, a lack of sponsorship, and basically what it does is it elongates the development process out significantly in such a way that you just don't operate with speed. So we've got to be thinking much more coherently about how do we create what Amazon and we here are called two pizza teams. Two pizza teams are just this. You can see them small little groups. Nothing more empirical about this than the best working team. Two pizzas can feed them for lunch. But far more important is they're small, nimble, single purpose, and mostly independent in the way they operate. Now, they do have bridge connections because they got to synchronize periodically, but they do that through, we'll call them APIs, but they can stay focused on the one thing. And I've already told you they get to move 10x faster as a result of that, much like a startup would. And super important, when it comes to speed. However, and I should say this, like early days, bonding social capital has actually shown an improvement in these times. But here's a strict caveat: 15% increase to our 5 closest colleagues. And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more here in a few moments. And we know that drives productivity. This was a study I did many, many years ago. And basically, you can see that we could explain productivity, the variance of productivity based on cohesion alone by looking across 4 separate teams. And then an intervention is simply create more cohesion in the other teams. And in this particular case, we were actually able to improve productivity just by those simple moves by 25%. So super important to speed, super important to development, but also the same connections drive productivity. And that's what we're beginning to see is these 5 closest colleagues are becoming closer, which has actually driven productivity up in the short term for where we are in the world today. But I want to caution you, as I've said multiple times, the same study that posted that last survey, which was actually from Humanize, Ben Weber and his team, the previous one, is also saying managers are growingly more concerned that we're losing deep thinking and learning capabilities in these times. And this is where I want to anchor next, because I see some problems on the horizon. And as I mentioned, we've got some early signals on that. This is hard. Like right now, we're connected this way. First of all, it's not nearly as energizing for me. I can't even see you right now, which makes it even less energizing. And it makes it quite exhausting. And you can see, like we're not engaging with the same level of social richness. Social signals have dropped off. And some people aren't even showing up, right? Videos are off. You see somebody in the upper corner, that decided to turn their camera on and then they just disappeared. At least the others had enough social etiquette to shut off their cameras when they disappeared. And then, of course, we get some still silhouettes, but obviously this isn't as rich as being in a conference room or around the whiteboard generating something. And we're beginning to see, some signals that that's a problem for us. I want to propose that the things that concern me most are we emitting the same amount of energy? Will we have the same extent of emotional well-being? We are social creatures at our core. We join things that are bigger than ourselves so we can be part of the tribe. And that's where we get our identity. And it will have a long-term impact on social well-being. We're already seeing that. Tacit knowledge transfers person to person. I'll talk about this more. It's more caught than taught. And we're beginning to see this tacit learning begin to dissipate, which is hugely concerning to me from a cultural standpoint longer term. And I've already talked about innovation quite a bit. It is true that some of us are connecting to our 5 or plus closest colleagues, but some of us are having this experience as well. Some of us are really disconnecting. And we're beginning to see that on the network. Like it's looking like this. Some are becoming detached. It is true that some are attaching, but it is also true that we're beginning to see a lot of detachment. And in a remote environment, as many as 20% of our workers are struggling with loneliness. And I mean that at the emotional level. But in the previous slide, you saw that show up on the network. And we have to get out in front of this as people analytics professionals. Like, we've got to catch the early signals because it may be too late. Once people get cemented into these edge positions, it might actually be too late. So we've got to be paying attention to the early signals, which is one of the reasons I think relationships matter so critically, in these times, because we've got to do some things that are artificial to create these types of connections that just happen naturally when you're in a workplace, an environment where you have proximity to one another. I've already talked about energy. We are incredibly contagious beings. This was a study done at General Motors, actually, and you can see that, especially with de-energizing teams, that they suck the life out of us. They pull us down pretty significantly. Where these were newbies coming into an organization, you get a slight lift on the energy scale, on the high energy scale, mostly because we believe there's the grass is greener on the other side effect, coming in. So they already started at a higher point. But, energy is not emitting, across Zoom in the same way. And, this is how it shows up in a physical environment. We're contagious. Our positive energy spills over to those people next to us. Our negative energy also spills over. Rob Cross oftentimes says that like 5% of the people, 3 to 5% of the people bring 95% of the misery in an organization. You can almost see that here. This is actually not a terribly unhealthy network you see, because mostly the energy vampires are on the edge, where they are mitigated and can't have significant control for the most part. But my concern is in a virtual setting, this emission, but on both sides. The good thing is the negative emotions might not be transmitting. The bad news is if we're trying to emit it positively, it's a lot more challenging. It can be done, but it's a lot more challenging. Some teams are having fun and being creative to make that happen. And it certainly creates a boost. But as I'm going to show you later, in a virtual context, it's not one and done. Like doing a virtual happy hour once a month is nothing like the way we interact with each other in the workplace. And in fact, if anything, we should be amplifying it twofold or threefold in a virtual context. So if you did this once a month in the physical setting, you should do it 3 or 4 times a month in a virtual setting, because again, emission isn't as contagious as it is in the physical environment. And let me just get a little bit into tacit knowledge, and then I'll click into the final part of this presentation. This is the other thing we're beginning to see. I've already said this. Tacit learning is caught, not taught. So you can have the best learning systems in the world, but there are some things that we just have to understand through modeling with others. One of my favorite studies I've conducted, there are 3 groups here, and you can see one person, just activate one person who's like, who has a, we'll call it a strength in a given component. I can't even remember what the attribute was we were measuring here, and just using the friend to friends algorithm or the neighbor and neighbors algorithm, you can see, depending on the density of the network, you get some pretty significant coverage from some local person modeling a behavior. In the first case, you literally light up or affect as much as 63% of the group by thinking about how you really activate just a single person in a highly dense network. That begins to dissipate as the network density closes, or another way of saying that is bonding social capital begins to break apart. And you can see that it could drop in just this study, 3 groups, and there were many, many other groups we studied. You almost cut it in half in some regards, just based on the density of the network that creates spread. Why does that matter? We all care about our culture immensely. And culture also translates, much like energy in the network, it clusters. And we're working on a paper right now, actually Rob and I are working on a paper right now for Salone Management Review about this spread of culture in a network, and the power of O&A to really help us to really elevate the power, elevate the lens of being able to see the nuances of culture. And this is what we're beginning to see, is that certain behaviors, strengths, class or cluster and emit from person to person. This is physical, by the way. But the challenge is, how do you translate that into the virtual? And even though people may remain connected, the emission is dropping off. And I'm even going to argue that some of the connections are dropping off, which will make this even more problematic longer term. But this is what we're beginning to see. And you can see that that affects learning in a very big way. So let me anchor in to diffusion, just to talk a little bit about diffusion and a couple more concerns. Then we'll open it up for some Q&A. So a diffusion challenge is just like discovery, same kind of framework about bridge connections. I mean, here's a bridge connections have fallen off. Same study. Bridge connections, this is an external study, dropped off the cliff by as much as 30% already. I think that number's even lower now. And what we're losing are the progress connections. What we're losing are the outward-facing connections that help us first with discovery, and then secondly with diffusion. And I'll show you what that looks like. Here's a healthy network, lots of diffusion. Turns out in this particular case, it turns out that top performers in this org are very much positioned in a bridge connection. It's one of the ways they add value. Ron's work basically suggests that high performers tend to be more in this brokerage position. Certainly that was true in this particular study. And it turns out that, by about a 67% ratio, there are more top performers are bridged more so across the org. Here's why that's a problem. We're beginning to see this, and this was just simply me removing the top performers, no other bridge connections. And you can see you lose diffusion. You can see that all of a sudden, you're becoming very, very siloed in this org. There's still some bridge connections. So frankly, our top performers might be at most risk right now. And just as importantly, our ability to diffuse new ideas into first and out across an organization to scale them, to bring them into the world, is at significant risk right now. So we've got to be paying attention to that, because that means, long term, from an innovation standpoint, we've got some pretty significant risks over the horizon, and we've got to think about it a little bit differently. Now I want to go to another level, because I think we're seeing early signs of bonding erosion as well. You can see, the left slide here, the left template is the rapid decrease in bridging social capital, using betweenness as the metric. You can see, some uptick early days on bonding, but you're beginning to see bonding drop off. If you look at the closest, the inner circle, that's actually not true. But if you go to the 15, who are your top 15, you're beginning to see erosion and bonding as well. And you're beginning to see more clustering. What does that mean? It means that even our bonding social capital is at risk, and we're creating a neighborhood effect. So the new premise that I'll argue for here is we're becoming more neighborhood-like inside of our organizations. That becomes problematic on all kinds of levels. And this is what it begins to look like. I mean, this is a pretty healthy network. You can see lots of local bias. In this case, we'll call them strategic mindsets. You can see a group that's focused on, engineering excellence. You can see a group that's focused on operational. You can almost think of this as, how do you build something? How do you put it into manufacturing? And then you can almost, like in this case, see a sales team or a service team. There are lots of bridge connections there, very different biases, but a very healthy set of tensions that force the organization to keep all three of those things in balance. But this is, and real data, what we're beginning to see is this neighborhood effect. Not only are we losing bridge connections, I'll go back, not only are we losing the bridge connections across those three entities, but the entities themselves are beginning to fragment. you can begin to see, and again, I think we're very early days, so I hope I'm wrong on this notion, but you can start to see this neighborhood effect where, small sub pockets within a group are becoming more and more isolated. And I think, again, very early days, you can imagine a time where that sort of siloing becomes even more pronounced. And now all of a sudden we begin to lose some of those productivity benefits as well, over the long haul. Fatigue sets in, isolation sets in. So again, early days, but I think this field of O&A is more important than ever because it provides the MRI to be able to see things, in this virtual context that we maybe haven't been able to see in the past. So let me finish up with a couple more slides. One last thing I'm concerned about, and this is a study that was done many, many years ago, but it talks about these three primary channels for communication. This was an experiment that was actually done, and they were trying to build social capital through this experiment. They had a face-to-face group, University of Michigan, had a face-to-face group, and you can see 30 rounds in this study. I pick it up at 6. That's about when the face-to-face group had sort of optimized for their social capital. 6 interactions is another way of thinking about that. There's a video group, kind of like what we're doing here. There's a phone group, an audio group is another way of saying that. And then there's a text group or email would be another way of thinking about that. You can see that, both video and phone ultimately catch up. Both video and audio ultimately catch up from a connection standpoint. Text never does. Email is never a way to influence. But it takes 16 rounds for us to get even close to the richness of face-to-face, which is why I was saying earlier, many iterations matter. It takes up to 16 rounds. And this was a very simple experiment. I think as you get more complex in the nuances of day-to-day interactions, that may be elongated a bit. And it takes audio up to 26 rounds. And then you start to see a drop-off in all of them because I think this fatigue begins to set in. But, why do I share this? Because many people have never been way back to that BCG study. If you're satisfied with your connections, you're far more likely to be productive. Many people have virtually onboarded during these crazy times. Many people are living with this circumstance in a reality because they've never face-to-face interacted with any human being in their org. And it's only been through video. And we need to align our interventions to really wrap our arms around those people in a way unlike ever before. You can see that population in particular, productivity has actually dropped, at least initially, so below what it would have been for the people entering in face-to-face based on the baseline. And there are all these other issues that are beginning to emerge. Not well known to team, getting to know team members is a challenge. Receiving training or especially tacit learning is a problem. And understanding expectations, like what am I expected to do when I'm in isolation? Those are all problems. And we shouldn't be surprised by that because it's super hard the next set of slides is a bit of a simulation. It's even hard for us to anchor in virtually, in a physical context. It looks a little bit like this. You can see a lot of purple dots in this particular slide. These are people with less than 1 year of tenure in this network. You can see they're almost all on the edge, not everywhere, but mostly on the edge. This is 2 years, 1 to 2 years in. So let me show you that again. That's 1 year. That's 2 years, a little bit more gravitation towards the center. That's 3 years. And then you can see 3+ years. So in essence, and all the literature says this, Rob calls this the fast mover analysis. There are some people that can get there sooner, but it takes on average in a physical setting for people to get moved into the center of a strong cultured organization as many as 3 years. So now you add the barrier of lack of face-to-face interactions, and you can only imagine that curve doubling in some regards, which again, I hopefully have made the argument for why that's a problem long-term on all kinds of other dimensions. So I can imagine that we're going to be thinking about some new ways of working, and I'll finish on this slide. I don't think we're ever going to snap back because there are too many benefits, and we've shown early signs of being able to work virtually. But I think you're going to see some sort of agile hybrid. So to go back to adaptive space, 3 different types of connections. Certainly in the early days, we've been able to do the development side. How do we then create a model that's much more agile? So this, let's call this post-COVID, some new reality. I could imagine that you're going to have a bunch of independent virtual workers, but I imagine also that they're going to be clustered around sites. So you could almost think of certain types of work. If you think about these as modalities of work, certain times we can work alone and go back to our virtual workplace and get a lot done. But we're going to have to oscillate back and forth between sites and independent, working from our homes in such a way that is much more sophisticated than anything we've ever thought about. And I don't think that it's going to be an employee choice. It could be an employee choice. Employees have already made the choice for the most part. But I think it's going to be a much more eloquent set of solutions that will usher us into a new future of work. My dear friend Greg Pryor from Workday and I have been saying that, we think that the future of work has been fast forwarded through this grand experiment somewhere from 5 to maybe as many as 10 years. We've leveled the playing field. Everyone knows what it's like to be virtual, but yet we need to think about what will it look like when work sites open back up, and how can we bring people back in? Maybe it's not a day a week or 2 days a week. That's too simple. It's going to be much more about the work that's pulling people back into a site. So you can imagine a day where people are flowing in and out of sites predicated on work modalities. When they need to be discovering and they're bringing customers around, they're going to be on site because face-to-face is far more rich. When they're producing and developing within their own team, virtual actually works with a few periodic interactions, team building events, back on site, but not nearly to the extent of what you need for discovery. And then ultimately, when it comes to diffusion, you've got to connect up across groups in order to scale ideas. And I think, on-prem being in-site most of the time with some virtual complement from tools is kind of a new mode of thinking about the future of work. So I talked really fast. I know there was a ton there. This is a hypothesis slide here, but I will open it up for questions. I think we've got a few moments left to dive deep into anything. And like you always do so well, challenge any of that thinking in a way that could be constructive. So thank you.
Well, hey, first off, I have to be careful because I don't want to come across as a Michael Arena groupie because but I am such a fan, and you've heard me say this before, I think, and maybe not. I cite a Chinese proverb quite often. The beginning of wisdom is calling things by their right names. And you bring in a whole level of language which is very specific and truthful, and it raises awareness even of itself. And so one of the things that I want to ask with that as the basis is organizational network analysis, social network analysis, relationship analytics, whatever you want to call it, has been in favor over the last 5-6 years. It's as Rob has said, yeah, I'm a one-trick pony. I ride one horse, but that horse is running really fast right now, or something to that effect. The question is this: is that it used to be kind of a nice to have, this thing over on the side, but increasingly it's becoming core, particularly given that we're in this remote work environment, that interactions are really determining not only productivity, but well-being as well. So in terms of those who are thinking about how to make these investments with these scarce resources on how to understand the workforce better, you've laid it out just now, but what would you say to them in terms of, okay, you need to be prioritizing this approach because, why is it important? Why is it critical?
I mean, two things. No, thank you, Al. Thank you for the question. And I've heard Rob, say many times, it's a one-trick pony for me, and he certainly has taken the field to, I credit him for so much of what I've been taught. And he's taken it to a depth that continues to progress. Two things come to mind, Al, that I think we've got to be super careful about. And I think the first statement is even more broad than O&A. And that is that, like, we got to fall in love with problems, not solutions. O&A can be looked at as a solution. You clearly see I'm a zealot. You clearly can see that I start with a bias from the very beginning. I'm constantly guarding myself to not commit malpractice by overusing a solution and really anchoring into the problem at a whole different level. So solve problems, don't apply solutions first. And so that's the first thing, like, fall in love with the problem, not the solution, number one. Then that leads to the second point, which is, I think sometimes, like, we want to solve the world's issues, but anchor into one. Go find one sponsor, one customer inside your organization. Go find one problem, intimately get to know it, and try to use this, if appropriate, of course, along with other things. You're getting a very strong O&A bias here. We complement O&A with everything, which is why we're looking at behaviors mapped on top of it and all those other things that we were measuring before. But I would say, go find an advocate, a sponsor, and get started there. We should never. I've coached more people over my years who've used O&A, who've started really big with it. Like, I'll give you an example, one story, anecdote that comes to mind. Somebody wanted to plug O&A into their company, and they thought, well, wow, I got an opportunity to do this at a leadership conference with the top 300 people across a very large company you would all know. And I can run an O&A for each of them. And what we'll do is we'll look at how they interact with each other, and we'll use it as part of the leadership conference. Well, about 20% of the people really loved it. I don't know, maybe another 20% were intrigued by it. And then the rest were basically saying, 60% of the organization's asking the question, what are we going to do with this? Like, that's cute. It's interesting. It's fascinating. But so I've always been of the bias, without being too long-winded about this, to start small, anchor into a real problem, solve that problem, and then let that problem build the narrative for you. Let the solution to that problem build the narrative for you, as opposed to going too big too fast.
I love that reply, and particularly falling in love with the problem. If you're good with it, I want to ask a couple questions from the audience, from listeners. Seshigar wants to know this, and I'm glad she's asking. Can you talk about the problem with neighborhood networks versus the two pizza networks? Why is one better or worse?
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. So two pizzas, it's all about intention. So the other part is, like, what's the problem you're trying to solve is about what is the intention in the moment. Two pizza teams are incredibly good for development. So they move really fast, and I anchor into them all the time whenever you're trying to move with speed. The neighborhood effect, and again, this is early days, so I'm still trying to figure this out. We're still trying to figure this out. Then the neighborhood effect is when you start to see those groups splinter, and what you're really interested in is more diffusion and or discovery. So as you create less and less bridge connections across time, and these things begin to split off from one another, what you end up getting is sub-optimization in one neighborhood over another. It's really the connections between the neighborhoods that I'm most concerned about. But we're even seeing that happen within groups that had lots of bonding social capital. I think one of my very first slides, I referred to the gray dots as the blob. The blob is really good at executing and producing. As you get more neighborhood effect there, what you end up losing are the healthy tensions that happen inside that blob. And I think that will have long-term ramifications, but to be completely honest with you, we're so much in the early days of that that I don't know. I don't know.
Well, Michael, we're getting a ton of questions here, and we're not going to be able to get to them all today. And you're getting some positive love in the chat as well, which is very unsurprising. It's just like I really am a fan of what you're sharing, and I know there's a lot of others who feel similarly. So thank you for what you do. I am going to do this on your behalf, sir, and I am going to highlight adaptive space. This is right behind me. I told you it was right behind me. So there it is. It sits right here. So viewers of my podcast and show can see it. So if you haven't done so, give it a read. But any closing comments?
No, I think we're at an inflection point. I love what has happened in the people analytics space. Like I oftentimes, I play in the broader HR space, and I'm oftentimes a cynic of HR, if I'm honest, because I again think that HR is a very responsive organization at large, and I'm not speaking for any one organization, but as a function, the people analytics space within HR is, first of all, nascent, although grown significantly. And I look at each of you, and I like to presume I'm one of you in many regards. I look at each of us as sort of the future of HR. We're the ones that are looking out. I mean, you by very nature being here today are a bridge person. By that very nature, it means you're outwardly focused and looking for progress. So I like want to challenge us as a profession to reinvent this thing we call HR and organizations. And this is only one lens, O&A, but there are many, many others. So I'm thrilled, Al, of what you and the broader organization has been able to grow. And just, I'm all in on this.
Well, Michael, you're very kind. Keep being your awesome self, sir, and hope to be together with you before too long. Maybe share a beer up there in Seattle when the time is right. But again, thank you for joining us today. Really, really appreciate it. All right. Be well.
Thanks, my friend. Thanks, everyone. Bye.